So my name is Katra Taris, and I am the Director of Programs and Partnerships at San Francisco Art Institute. And we have been working on this professional development series with a number of SFAI staff and Art World community members talking about different topics related to artists. And today we have Julie Phelps from Counterpulse to talk to us about the process of applying for residencies and some of what Counterpulse does. Thank you so much
Great.
for being here.
Pleasure. Hi, Christina. um, all right, so I have just created a kind of compilation of some of my own guidelines that I use for actually applying for grants, with some of my reflections on sort of best of proposals that Counterpulse has received from artists applying for projects. Um, I do think that there's a really interesting pathway between being an independent artist, pitching a specific artistic project to somebody like Counterpulse or another curator, and then an institutional process of also taking projects and pitching them to granting agencies. Similarly, artists can learn a lot from writing residency proposals for the process of beginning to write grants for their own work. So I think I just wanted to point out that I've observed this parallel throughout the years and make it more explicit so that you also realize that cutting your teeth in writing strong proposals actually ends up getting a lot of mileage because it, will open up presentation opportunities, residency opportunities, but also funding opportunities. So I think most of this applies across all of those different mediums because it's more of a how to do it than exactly what to do. So I'll start with the approach. So generally, I recommend approaching whatever project proposal narrative, sort of the written content that you create to describe your project. You want to do perspective taking on this before you really put pen to page. Who are you writing it to? What are whoever you're writing it to, what priorities do they have? Maybe their priorities are different than yours, but do they align? And even if, so if they do align essentially, but can you talk about your project and so that they can see how your priorities align? So some ways to do this are, of course, just really actually reviewing guidelines, eligibility, and any like open call content that's put out. But don't just review it for like, okay, what do I have to do to pitch my project to these people? But pay attention to the language that the open call is written in. Like, do they use certain types of words? Like, do they talk about community engagement or do they talk about audiences? Do they talk about process more or do they talk about presentations and products more? And take note of these trends that you might see in the language that they use. And it's akin to code switching. I wouldn't recommend obviously transforming your project to fit people's guidelines, but you can do the work of making your project in the language that you know is going to resonate with them because you can see that they're using it themselves. Um, so, and I think the caution there would be make sure not to be trite in this process. Like, using the funders or the curator's language to describe your project. If they're like, we're looking for innovative, risk-taking projects, and the first line of your proposal is like, my innovative and risk-taking project, it may seem, I've received projects where it seems a little bit too heavily using my own language to talk back to me and to basically tell me like, I am everything you want. Look at, I used all of your language. But then it makes me feel like the artist is obscured and I don't actually know what that artist wants to do other than that they read my curatorial language very, very carefully. So there's kind of a give and take there. The other process of like perspective taking when just initially preparing the sort of general description of a project is to pretend like you know nothing about the project or about yourself. Like you don't know who you are, you don't know what this project is, and perhaps even going as far to imagine that you may not know very much about the specific form or discipline that you're practicing. So you don't want to take for granted that somebody knows why, interdisciplinary arts that includes live art and visual art is a really important intersection. People might not know that. You can see how much you think your selection panel knows by the open call language, but oftentimes the person who writes the call language is not actually the person on the panel. And so I think it's really important to, well, not to boil down your work to a kind of elementary level, is to make a case for each thing along the way as if you really are describing something that somebody doesn't know something about to them. Um, a thing that I've found useful and in reading proposals as well as creating successful proposals myself is also criticality. So after you've written a draft, say, going back over your narrative and reading it and seeing what critiques you could imagine somebody having of this. Um, like, does it seem possible? Do you actually explain how you're going to achieve what you say you're going to do? And if you feel like you don't, add that back in. Or if you think, oh, maybe somebody could think that I'm a really young artist to be able to execute a project with so many partners or so many collaborators. Like I say here that I've been making solo work and this is my first ensemble work. Um, you know that that's going to raise questions for somebody if you put yourself in their position. So then just go the extra mile to actually answer the imagine the panel having. I've found that with panel review processes, one loose end can unravel an entire proposal, and it can be even the most insignificant loose end. Like, just you didn't mention that you already have an established partnership with the main, social service organization that's going to be involved in your community outreach, that's an existing partnership, but you just didn't mention that one thing, and that just one missing detail can make people feel like you don't have a feasible plan, and then all of a sudden the entire review of your proposal is colored by it not seeming feasible, even though everything else might really seem feasible. So just really making sure to tie up every loose end. So this is kind of the sort of the overall approach to creating a narrative, perspective taking, and really putting yourself in the seat of the reviewer. This isn't an artist statement, I think is one way of saying this. And I think a lot of time artists have a sort of, they maybe grapple with personal integrity and almost a certain kind of ethics around creating pitches where they want to write an artist statement and they want to feel like it's really, really true to their most like essential artistic voice. And that is a fine thing to feel. And there's a time and place for that. And a pitch is not that place, in my opinion. You don't need to contort yourself, nor do I think you should, but you really are trying to speak to somebody. And so translating your vision into language that other people can understand and relate and how it relates to their priorities is the task of a pitch or a proposal, not your artistic manifesto. So that's the sort of approach. Then there's kind of just like really like practical brass tack things. Uh, so one way I would describe some of these next recommendations is that while there's the picture that you're painting of the project that you want to do, and that's going to be obviously of the utmost importance to the person selecting your project, there's also all of these other signals that you're sending to the selection panel in all of the ways you do your proposal. An example being that I know that for an artist in residence to be successful at Counterpulse, they need to be able to meet deadlines, have a strong command of written language, because we demand of our artists in residence to do blog posts and so while those questions aren't in the are you really good at writing blog posts isn't a question in my proposal form, I'm gleaning that information off of all of the ways that the artist constructs the proposal. And so just as you move through the creation of a proposal, being mindful also of it as a composition, just as like your artwork would be a composition, the spatial, visual, timing, cadence through it, like take that on when writing a proposal. Make sure that it actually is well done and that you feel proud of it as like a piece at the end. And that's everything from how you approach the narrative and the language you use, but also your font choices and your spacing and your format and these sorts of things. Like, how does it look as a product? So some of those kind of more brass tack things that I think sort of all come together into this composition is the sort of simple task of answering all of the questions in the order that they've been asked. Typically, some kind of open call or proposal form will have a series of questions, and then each question will sometimes have 2 or 3 kind of compound questions. And I, when I approach a proposal, and certainly when I'm reading proposals that people have written to me, none of those questions were arbitrary. I didn't put a proposal in my full proposal form for artists to fill out and just be like, yeah, it doesn't matter to me if they answer that. Like, I've thought a lot about those questions and I want answers to those questions. So like actually just addressing them. And I think that this is also like the way in which the proposal as form also comes into play, where it's like, again, it's not a manifesto. You don't need to worry about creating creative responses necessarily to the questions. It's more important to be like, I've answered your question, I've answered your question, I've answered your question, to give them the information they actually need to select your project or not and determine fit. So like some pitfalls along the way are oftentimes proposal forms will ask similar questions, but they're not identical. And that can be frustrating, especially when you're working with limited word counts. But still, I think still go through the motions of answering the question. I think it's really useful to create over time, or you could do it as a startup process of like creating yourself some boilerplate text, like answer generically, like what is your artistic background, what is your ethos around engaging community or audiences, what is, and you can kind of have these sort of stock answers that are kind of your standard, your standard outlook on these things that you can then kind of refry for the process of creating proposals. And this can be really helpful in the process of just getting them out. I think that's another overall recommendation, is that you just need to actually apply to a lot of things, and getting rejected is part of the process, actually. And it's sometimes even better to measure your success by the number of rejections you receive than the number of successful proposals, because it means that you're really putting yourself out there. And that's half the battle, is like not falling on the stumbling block of just feeling like you can't do it. Where are you going to start? So the next thing I have is that information and language redundancies are avoided. So again, you may be feeling like you're asked the same question twice, but try and provide unique answers to each one, and don't say things more than once. And this is, again, a difference maybe between creative writing and proposal writing, where it might be sort of interesting to you to say something and then find another poetic way of saying it again or something. And to a certain extent, I think that that's fine, but also often with word limits, you want to be really careful to create really succinct points that are also, if you just really imagine the practicality of being a panelist with your pen and being like, I'm going to underline the main points here. Like, it should be really, there should be like sound bites in it where you're like, oh, that's the point, like make sure that you've done the like one line answer kind of thing, which you could then go on to explain. So then the other thing is about voice. So voice is consistent throughout. So I have a very different sort of voice, or almost personality, that I put on when I'm writing proposals, that is different than, how I would write conversationally in emails or that kind of thing. But taking time to develop that voice, but more important than whatever choices you make around that, is just using it consistently throughout. So some really simple things are you going to refer to yourself in third person, or are you going to say I? Are you going to say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, or the artist is going to do this, the artist is going to do that? And I feel like you can make whatever choice you're more comfortable with, but whatever choice you make, stick to it. So a lot of times I'll see that the artist will, in their sort of, tell me about your artistic background, they'll use I language, and then they've clearly just like, oh, and then they slapped in 1 or 2 pasted lines from their bio, which is in third language, because that's third party voice, third person voice. And they just, didn't really realize that they're kind of switching between the two things. And now while it can get the content across, it's again this sort of like reading it as a composition, it's sloppy. And as much as I have a forgiving nature, I also want to see that people are really taking the proposal process seriously, because I want to know that for them, the residency that they're applying for is something that they're really eager to do and that they're taking seriously. And from the moment of the proposal, if they can't even read over something twice, it sort of instantly distances me from me feeling like they're taking this as a really serious opportunity. So whatever you do, make a choice and then proofread your work and make sure that you made a consistent choice throughout. Generally speaking, also use direct language, and no passive voice. Try and remove your INGs. Also, just experiment. And I think it's kind of emboldening to just remove all of these I will, my aim, my intent is to, my belief is that, and just say not say the project will serve community by bringing together a cohort of peers. Just say the project brings together a cohort of peers, and you can always go back into softer language if somehow that seems appropriate. But I think it's an interesting challenge and it's a confidence building thing to not say, well, my hope is that the project will bring together, will have this impact on the community by bringing together a cohort of peers. So just using the direct language, not stating things as going to happen in the future, but as if they're like the project is doing it already. And the sort of next point after voice is just like factual and functional information known and proposed is complete and accurate and consistent throughout the proposal. And when you run a risk of this is that maybe you've been writing proposals for this project over a number of years at this point, and collaborators have changed throughout the years, or you go back to a really old proposal and you grab out that paragraph and it talks about, I will engage this graphic designer, but then you list the graphic designer as a confirmed collaborator down below or something like that. And it's an easy thing to get tripped up on, but really making sure that everything that's listed as fact or functional detail of the project is consistent and referred to as the same throughout the project. Like if up top you're calling it the forthcoming publication, and then down below you're calling it the book that we published, like that. Again, it creates these loose ends that can really unravel an entire proposal. So I want to just reiterate, and this is also, of course we all do this differently, but Counterpulse in particular has been very, very successful in receiving grant funds. And one of my sort of commitments to my staff learning from me how to write grants is to have expressed all of this. So of course it's just one person's way of doing it. But I do hope that you can find some value in these, like what might seem like incredibly elementary recommendations, because I think we all need to be reminded that the devil's in the details once in a while. And so then the next section just goes back to this idea of like creating a composition and treating your proposal as a piece. So when I'm done writing, I look at the entire thing like, have I used the same font throughout the entire thing? Is everything 1.15 line spacing, or is that paragraph not? That's different. Are all the margins the same? Are all the headers the same? Did you put page numbers on it? Just that the formatting is absolutely immaculate and that there's never an exception. And I just think that it communicates to your funder that you're taking it seriously. And also you're often proposing to create a product during one of these residencies. And it also shows people that you know how to follow through on creating something specific. And that includes like, when you save the file to your desktop before emailing it into them, put your name in the file name. Like you're not the center of everyone's universe. You're the center of your own universe. You don't need to put your name in your own file names, but this isn't for you, this is for them. And so make sure that you understand their side of the work, put your name in the file, send it to them, put context in the email that you attach it to. Just make sure that you're showing them that you are ready and you're a professional artist that's ready to partner with a professional producer to create an excellent product, and you know what it takes, and you're ready to attend to the details. I just think that that comes through in how you submit your proposal, including spelling and grammar errors. Okay, so those are some of my main recommendations. And the other thing that I would say is that oftentimes we don't have really specific questions that a grantor has asked us, or an open call asks for, and they're just developing a sense of what you need to do, even if you don't know what they want to hear from you, you know? So always make sure that you describe what you're going to do. I work in the dance field, and I think the dance field is blessed and cursed with a very conceptual sort of approach to projects. And it's really beautiful sometimes to read the language that artists have created for like what their project is, conceptually addressing. And of course, I care a lot about that, but oftentimes it's at the expense of just telling me what they're going to do. Like at the end of it, I'll just be like, if I didn't know that I'm a dance organization, I wouldn't even know this is a dance project. Like they don't mention who's going to be on stage, if there's going to be anybody on stage, like, but I know that they're really interested in like mediated identities in the time of screen overload or whatever. And I'm like, that's all cool, but like, what are you going to do? So just make sure, again, to just say in very clear language what it actually is. And it's really, really useful and illuminating as a panelist to just have the artist say, this piece will have 5 dancers, 1 electronic musician. We plan on making a 45-minute composition through a devised process that is starting now. And, and you're like, okay, that I can imagine that. And then also just, of course, like your other classic questions, like when is it happening? Where is it happening? Has it already begun? Have you not started it yet? Is there other support for the project? Is it happening on a stage? Is it a piece of artwork? Make sure to be specific. Also, in terms of, the why, so that's the conceptual. Like I said, the dance field is often very good at talking about the why, but maybe not the what. We also have a gallery program at Counterpulse, and I find like a discipline specific difference here, where oftentimes visual artists, there'll be absolutely no description of why they made work, or, and again, this isn't your manifesto. I even have political issues with the idea of why, or having to justify your work. And I encourage you to take issue with that, but I also think that it's important to realize that other people want to know why your work is important. And even addressing it, and you can be as bold as you want. I mean, I would even just be satisfied for somebody to say like, fuck social relevancy. I don't care about that. My work stands alone as a beautiful object, and that's all it is, and that's why it exists. I would be like, okay, like I may or may not agree at that point, but I would be like, I accept that as a why. But it's not just that like you forgot to mention, or like for not even mention, but like my worry is that when I read a proposal that doesn't really seem to mention why somebody's work is important, it's like, well, you're you. If anybody knows why this work is important, it's you. Like, how is anybody else supposed to know if it's important or not, So she just shows like a consideration and a certain amount of self-consciousness, a certain amount of knowing I'm in the world, artists are a dime a dozen. I get that. My work is still important. Let me tell you why. And I don't mean to be crass. Of course, everyone's practice is unique, and I don't mean a dime a dozen, but you sometimes are just in a pool of 150 applicants, and you really need to make a case for your work and be bold enough to say that your work is important and say why it is important. And then of course the who, is the project for an audience? Is the project for a gallery? If it is for an audience, who is it? One of the kind of most classic answers that I get on proposals when asked, who is your audience? Is I get the, my work is for everyone, And it's like, well, that's really great. I'm glad that you're not, prejudiced and discriminating against people, but at the same time, it shows me that you don't actually really know who your audience is, and that you maybe haven't examined it, because not all work is for everyone. And so really, who is your audience? And if you feel like you don't know the answer to that question, I think it's something you should somehow find an answer to, either by creating an ideal audience, being really specific, like, if I could choose my audience, who would it be? Or doing data collection, surveying your audience, and actually saying, well, yeah, they're white people between the ages of 25 and 35. And just say that. And I surveyed my audience. This is who it says. I have goals of expanding my audience to also reach these people, and this is how I plan to do that. Like, that's a really strong proposal response. My work is for everyone, is just a little underexamined. And then making sure that you create a case for how your work is feasible and executable, and that you have the skills to do it. So if your project is presented in such a way where it just doesn't seem like you know what it's going to take to do it, or even worse, if you can kind of sometimes tell as a presenter if somebody's like reused a proposal form for kind of from a different application, and they clearly just aren't taking into consideration what Counterpulse's resources are. Where somebody's like, yeah, I'm gonna like have the audience in 3 different spaces, and they're gonna rove around, and I'm just like, I don't have 3 different spaces. Like, what are they even talking about? Have they ever even been to Counterpulse? That's another one. Like, if you're going to apply for residencies or opportunities with arts organizations, I do recommend attending their programming and being able to say some kind of, like, there's a question in my proposal form that's like, why do you want to do this at Counterpulse? And I find it really, really compelling when people have a good answer to that question. Like when people just say, because I could really use some rehearsal space. I mean, more or less, when people are like, yeah, I really need rehearsal space, and having somebody support a production would be cool. I'm like, I get that. Like, that I totally understand. That's why we do it. It's supportive of artists. But when an artist is like, well, I want to do this because I want support, it's like, well, yeah, of course, I know you want support, but why Counterpulse? And if you don't have a compelling answer for that, then maybe you also need to consider whether or not you should be spending your time on writing a proposal to an organization who you don't really even know or understand or care about. Because it's work to write these proposals. And while I do encourage just generating things and getting it out, it's also like, to a certain point, you shouldn't be wasting your time just like, scattershotting your work all over the world. Like, get specific where you think your work fits, and approach that with integrity and intent. And that usually pans out better. And then again, just the resources around the feasibility is just being, I think it's like one of those things that's better mentioned explicitly than like left to the imagination. Like, who are your collaborators? Are they confirmed or are they pending? If our key collaborators are missing, don't just not mention that. Like, mention the 3D video designer that is obviously key to this 3D video project I'm making is not a confirmed collaborator yet. This is my search process on how to find them, so on and so forth, where sometimes we'll just exclude the information we don't have, but it's actually better to include that you recognize that you don't have it, so that again, with these loose ends, somebody's like, well, they mentioned all this 3D video design, and then in the collaborator list there's no 3D video designer. Like, how is that going to work? Okay. So I have another section on budgets, but I feel like this is a little bit less germane to this specific topic. Because oftentimes residency proposals don't actually require any budget, and they're there's supported opportunities where you're given an artist fee and resources. But I do recommend undergoing the process of developing budgets for your projects. Um, it's again, a lot of the curators that are going to be looking at working with you are themselves producers also, and knowing that the artists that I select are ready to like actually like get down to business and make a project, given like whatever resources there are, and that there's a sort of shared understanding of like generative limitations and possibilities is super useful. So really try and get an understanding of like what is your how big is your project and what kind of money will it actually take to accomplish what you're trying to do, is honestly, I think the responsibility of every artist in the kind of US context where every artist to some extent that I know, from the most successful to the most emerging, is doing some type of self-producing in some regard. And so getting friendly with budgeting and just making cost projections for projects is a really useful skill. And it kind of goes back to this whole first point I made around like, how are you going to approach the narrative, and how are you going to explain to the person you're pitching to that your project is doable? And if you can't, sometimes it's running the numbers of like, well, I'm going to get paid $1,000 and this other person's going to get paid that much and blah, 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 blah. And you get to the bottom of that list, and then you might even discover yourself like, oh, like this residency only gives me $2,000 artist fee. And to have these 5 collaborators, I already don't have enough money, and that would be my other point about scale and scope and feasibility, is that also just imagining that projects aren't just one thing. And I think more established artists have maybe a better sense of this, but that projects may happen in different phases and have entirely different resources at each different phase. That there may be an R&D phase of the project where there's just you and one other collaborator working on concept development and, like just initial research, dramaturgy, auditions, things like that. And that can have its own grants and its own residencies and everything. And then you can have, the execution stage of a project. And I think it also shows that you're savvy if you know that, like if you were like, this is actually a 3-year project, and this residency is going to support the initial phase of the project. And what's going to happen in that initial phase is this. And then in the future, all of this other stuff is going to happen. So you can kind of still benefit from the like big vision you have and describing that big vision, but then kind of break it down and talk about really specific parts of your project. And those are competitive proposals. I've given residencies to people, where I know that the resulting product out of that residency isn't the final product for that artist or that project. And is, especially if that's clear from the beginning, that can be a perfectly valid thing to support as a curator. But again, that's where you need to really read the guidelines, because some guidelines will require that it result in a world premiere of an original commission. And so just being specific about what opportunities you're putting into your roster of things to go after at different points in different projects. All right, well, that's kind of like me rattling off a list of a lot of recommendations on proposals. I would be curious to just open it up for specific questions or other just general questions that people have around pitching their work and their experience in that. Any questions?
Yes, hey Christina, I was just going to say, feel free to unmute or video or whatever you feel comfortable with.
Thank you. I was taking notes and I realized that I was making more sounds than necessary. Thank you so much for doing this, first of all, and I hope everybody's well.
Yeah.
My question is, to go back a little bit on the budget, I think that when I submit proposals or when I start working on the proposal, that's the biggest, like, oh my gosh, I'm against the wall. Like, okay, we need to talk money. I'm an artist. I never have money. You might give me money. So, so how do I handle all of that? Because I feel that the proposals that I've sent out that require me to dispel the money issue, I don't feel comfortable. I've sent them out and I still feel like I didn't really resolve that very well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, and I think that the relief that I would say is that just like the content in your proposal, like the narrative part of your proposal, this is a proposal. None of this is real yet. So you can feel comfortable saying like, this project will be a really beautiful, amazing stage work with tons of dancers. And like, frankly, it's not that yet, but you know, you're saying, you're projecting out into the future a vision of a project that exists, right? And allowing that same license for the budget. And so you might not have the money right now, but you can say, okay, so I'm gonna do an Indiegogo campaign, and that's gonna raise $3,000. I'm gonna write a TBA cash grant, and that's gonna raise $5,000. I'm gonna write one of those CCI artist grant things, and that's gonna be another $2,000. And like, you don't know if you're going to get those things, frankly. And, but you can include them in a budget when it's a proposal budget, you're just saying, I'm going to go after these things. I hope to get them. And then just, you kind of create the sort of inflated version of the budget because you know that things could not come in. Like, okay, if you have 3 different grants in there, you may actually only get 2 of them, but you also can say, okay, well, but the artist fees can also be negotiable. Like, okay, you want to pay people like a bunch of money, that would be awesome. But so you can kind of know that there's a way to evolve the budget. But I understand that it's tricky and you don't want to paint yourself into a corner. But that said, like, in all of my experience in receiving support, residencies, grants myself, and in my role as a producer, supporting people in those ways, never have I ever kind of had a moment where something has changed in terms of what's possible in the scope of the project, and where in a completely like earnest and forthcoming way, I go to the person who I'm working with and I'm like, you know what, that like SFAI thing that I thought I was going to get, I didn't get it. And so I'm not going to be able to produce the whole video part of this whole project. I just thought I was going to, and I can't, and I don't have the support, and I can't do it. And like, I wouldn't be like, I'm taking your residency away from you. I would be like, well, you roll the dice, and just like I rolled the dice in selecting you, and now that we're on, we're going to make whatever project is possible. Like, and this has been a big transformation in my relationship to funders too, is like transforming my expectation of what relationship we're really under, where I'm like, I'm not coming to you and asking for you to give me money by making all of these promises that I then need to like twist myself in a pretzel to achieve. I'm your partner. Like, without me, you have no mission execution. And you take a risk on me by selecting me. I take a risk in terms of embarking on a project that I'm not sure I'm going to be able to gather all the resources for. And we have to allow each other to adapt in order to see through a project. Projects change. They change from the time of proposal. The budget changes. The collaborators change. Sometimes the whole thing changes. Your mother died midway through, and you're just making an entirely different piece now because your life has changed. And I think if you bring that, if you trust your own ability to communicate the changing circumstances of your budget, that any producer you're working with will understand and work with you to change, to continue to evolve a project. It's one of the first things I say to artists when I select them is like, we selected you based on the project that you proposed, but now we've selected you, and we want you to tell us if anything changes, but we understand that your project will change. And honestly, it would be concerning if it didn't, like if you select somebody a year in advance of the premiere date of their show and the project doesn't change at all, like you know, we're like, we're inviting you to take risks and to innovate. Like we want you to be changed by this residency. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, and it involves the budget, but also other things. Just the confidence to know that like this is a proposal, it's your best intention. You haven't like knowingly made false promises, but you also like you just have confidence that like if it changes, it's gonna change. And then, but right now, this is a solid plan. I don't know. Does that seem, does that like help build the confidence? It's also just a practice thing, just like just doing it, you know?
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you. And I also appreciate all the other tips that you gave us, because it's never enough for us to hear. Like some of us like write a little bit more than others. And then, you know, even though some of us have different experience writing for grants and proposals and residencies, it never hurts to hear all over again, like all those little important nuances of writing and getting the message out there. So I was taking notes, even though some of these things feel like, yeah, we know that kind of,
Yeah,
maybe forget the
exactly.
process. So yeah,
Yeah,
thank you.
especially when you're working on deadlines, you're just like, okay, you
Oh
know,
yeah,
you can kind of let go of things you know are the important stuff.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Any other questions?
Or feelings about how does your art practice kind of fill into the residency format? I'm kind of curious if, um, I've seen a lot of things where artists kind of quote that they're in residence during quarantine as well, which
Mm-hmm.
I thought was kind of a interesting pun. And I'm curious to see how many artists kind of look into residencies after these points too, when maybe jobs have been lost or stuff like that, but finding these spaces and these kinds of modes of support for practice to be kind of refreshing too.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and that reminds me of just I think the scarcity model that a lot of people I either actually under or at least maybe feel that they're under will sometimes make people go after opportunities that actually don't serve where they're actually at in their practice process, human body space. Like the Counterpulse residency is a developmental residency, but it's mostly like a production residency. It's like it's a 5-month long residency. In 5 months, you're on stage and there's a lighting designer and there's an audience, you know? And it's like, you know, it's like sometimes artists will get into the process and just be like, no, I don't want to help with outreach. I'm feeling like I just need to be in a reflective process. And I'll be like, listen, like no hate on like needing reflective time, but like you applied for a production residency. You're just gonna have to invite your friends to come to a show. Like, I'm sorry, you're making a show, so now you have to do that, you know? So like even if things are feeling scarce and you want to just apply to anything that gives you any money and supports your practice, I'd also say like make sure to be discerning that you actually want to do what you're applying to do. And if like you really want to just be in the woods and like not be pressured to like you know, create a product or engage an audience or like, you know, then like do not apply to production residencies. Like it'll feel wrong, and you maybe will have kind of blown that opportunity with that particular organization or that curator, because they'll just you know, you'll just be like at odds with each other, you know? um so like in terms of COVID, I feel like people are kind of self-creating residencies because they're kind of on, you know, some version of lockdown. So people are just like reframing it in a positive light to say like this, I'm going to treat this time as a residency time. I actually think that's really productive. And I think giving yourself the license um, to see the opportunities that you create for your own work and your own practice as actually legitimate opportunities for you to advance in your career and your practice, and is important, because we get stuck in validation loops, right? We're like, I'm not really making art or doing my thing unless like some institution is validating me and saying like, yes, I pick you, you know? And and that's just a trap. I mean, because again, it could be an issue of fit. It might not be what you actually need right then in your practice, but also finding ways to feed your own practice. And like, again, it's just like, we're all in the boat where to a certain extent we're self-producing our own work, at least most people I know, literally like everyone I know basically. Even people who are like on paper and might seem super successful, like they're still producing their own work. And so for them to be able to identify in their own sort of internal mechanisms what a project needs and when it needs it, and what sometimes it might need a like weekend of writing, it doesn't, and that's really what it needs, is like taking that space boldly and letting it serve your process, instead of spinning out that you don't have somebody who's like paying you to do a writing weekend. Yeah, I get that that's tricky, because a lot of us, like, you know, are expected to work and labor on our art practice without getting paid for it at all. And I guess I'm just saying, like, yeah, that's true. that is an expectation. um like an artist applied to Counterpulse's residency many times and hadn't made a work since undergrad. And like every time the proposal, I was like really interested in the proposal, but there was just no work sample, no indication of any public engagement, doing anything since being an undergrad. And eventually I was just like, this is the fourth time you've applied with the same project. My feedback is the same. I'm interested in the project, but that, you know, I don't actually have a sense of where you're located, what you're doing. Like, you know, we're not really in the business of like supporting students, you know, like, are you making work outside of your school context, or what is going on, you know, basically. And she was basically like, yeah, like, I don't really want to make work when I don't have the support to do it. And so like, I haven't had support since undergrad. So like, I haven't been making work, and I've been doing teaching, and that's just what I do. And I'm like, kind of like, go girl. And also was like, you're never going to get a residency ever. You know, like, not in a hateful way, just, but in like, no one is exempt from you know, from self-producing themselves, like, for being number one in terms of the fan, you know, like, I'll support your work, you know, that needs to be you, you know, like, with your time, you know, or whatever. But yeah, you need good work samples. You need to show a curator and a producer that you're actually working, that that you have a work sample that's dated less than, you know, 3 years ago. Like, those are all an indication. And if you don't have institutional support to make that happen, you're, you know, like, we have to not be, as artists, we have to not be part of the problem of centering institutional gatekeepers as the only access to creativity. Because as an institutional gatekeeper, like, I try and undo that power, but when people keep endowing me with it over and over again, then it's sort of a constant sort of cycle of failure, where I don't think the only valid work happens inside of institutional contexts. But I can't convince an artist of that if they're not convinced of that themselves. So if they give me a work sample of something that they filmed in a field, like, I'll treat that seriously. It doesn't need to be done on a soundstage, but it needs to be done with a sense of self-respect, I guess. Like, that you can tell that person thinks that this is real, you know? Yeah, I guess that's kind of philosophical, but yeah.
I have
Yeah.
another question, actually. So I recently applied for a residency, and then this residency asked about the community engagement, which I'm very familiar with and I can activate in no time. And so I answer that, and then I submit the application, and 2 days later I'm thinking, what was that? You say you will engage the public and you're fine to do that after COVID-19, but what if the people are not ready to come to you? And I was like, oh my gosh, well, What would I assume that we're all gonna run out of the house and hug each other? That's probably not gonna happen. And
Right.
so that leads to the question and this wondering of what do you think and what do you think the timeline will be specifically for counterpoles to start activating and start bringing in people? And it's kind of like tough to think about it, and it affects all of us who work with people, who want to teach classes, who want to do community engagement, who want to like reconnect with people in a physical form. So I'm really worried about
Yeah.
these projects.
Yeah, me too. And um I think that I think the outlook is probably no sooner than 18 months where we'll be gathering in an assembly format in any way, just because I think that will be linked to the vaccine. And I have been reading a lot of like surveys and stuff that have been being administered to audiences, and that does seem very true. And to give a few examples of what Counterpulse is doing to address that, while also still trying to have an answer to this question, like how are we going to engage the community, is we're thinking about how to create artistic experiences that don't just move completely digital, as if it's just you can sub one out for the other, like, oh, and then we'll just do it on Zoom instead. Like, we all feel it isn't one for one, the trade-off isn't even. So the projects that have been postponed through the COVID experience, that I'm sort of currently juggling, are, we're talking about, now that we're looking at this horizon, okay, what parts of this project could move online and actually be really interesting as content made for screen? But we're not going to make dances that would be interesting to watch, but then are just kind of crap on a screen. So like, if we're going to make dances, they're going to be made for screen. And that's a different task. And it may not be something that you're skilled at as an artist. It's not the project you pitched to me. So, okay, well, let's figure out what's possible, but let's be context specific and recognize the shifting terrain. And then also, where I find a lot of interesting conversations are happening are saying, what are the other things we can do that aren't just assuming that we're going to all go digital and that that's going to be good enough? So can we take these projects and move them outside? Like, can this particular performance happen in Golden Gate Park in the Meadow for an incidental audience in October, when we're not sheltering in place anymore, but we're definitely not in 100 people in a room at Counterpulse still? And we've been talking with, like, well, it didn't really pan out, but like the Great Wall of Oakland, like, can we be screening things in these public contexts that create opportunities for community engagement that we're just previously not doing, but are interesting to us? What can we actually get interested in is what I'm trying to guide my own creative production in my role at Counterpulse. Like, if a project gives me a sense of dread, like, it probably isn't going to be interesting, because I think that shows through. So what actually feels interesting? And I'm like, I had an artist, for example, who we were like toiling right before this whole thing happened. They really wanted a dirt floor, like a packed dirt floor for like a piece that they were making, And I was like, I'm a yes person. I'm like, we're gonna figure this out. We're gonna get a dirt floor, and then all of a sudden this whole thing happened, and I was just like, duh, like, why make a dirt floor? Like, let's just go find some dirt and you can do your piece there, and we'll film it, or we'll invite an audience depending on where we are at in this whole thing by then. And it's like, it's of course you can always get entangled in the disappointment, but those opportunities have been like, okay, now that's interesting to me, and I think that following that, and I think at a time right now, like, I've been writing grants and proposals right now, and I just think that, like, just showing that you are aware of the changing landscape and that your artistic practice is robust enough to respond, in indicating that, even sometimes saying, like, I don't know what this is going to look like, these are some ideas I have. Like, at this point in history, I feel like that would be a really, like, that's almost one of the only valid responses you can give to a question that says, how do you plan on engaging the community? Like, and